The radiator coughs, the waxed floor throws back the hard lights, and the clerk skims past my name like a stone over water while I stand there in a scuffed coat, envelope soft at the corners, feeling the room decide who belongs. Across town she moves through blast-bright halls in clean sneakers and quiet authority, not my enemy, just a different weather. And I hear her voice in my pocket. 3 words on a card, 15 minutes set aside. Ask to see where it's written? Small rules that turn a locked door by degrees. Before I go on, hit subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. If this speaks to you, share it. Awareness protect our elders. The doors breathed open and let the cold ride in on my shoulders. The air in the library lobby smelled like wet paper and an old radiator. I stepped off the rubber mat and into the shine of waxed tile I could see my face in, and it told me what I already knew. I looked like I had been outside too long. My knuckles were dry and rough, the kind of rough that leaves little white lines when you bend the fingers. I took my cap off, slid it into my coat pocket, and went straight to the check-in table because that is what the sign said to do. There was a plastic holder with a stack of forms, blue ink pens chained to the base, a box of number slips, and a laminated card explaining how the line worked. The fluorescent lights ticked in the ceiling. The woman behind the computer read names from a screen and pushed them into the room beyond the turnstile. She read 3 names, then 4. None of them were mine. A man behind me coughed into his sleeve. The heater grumbled awake and coughed back through the vents. I kept my hand on my envelope like it was an extra rib. The brown paper had gone soft at the corners where I had been folding it and folding it again. Inside it were papers I could name, a note with my last visit date, a printed piece of a confirmation I'd asked for, 2 receipts I thought might matter. I set the envelope on the edge of the table, far from the stamp pad smearing purple in a circle, and waited for a chance to say my name. The chance did not come. The screen kept delivering other people's syllables into the air. A man with a scarf went in. A young mother balancing a stroller wheel on her heel went in. A teenager with a backpack that looked heavier than he was went in. A smell of winter coats and coffee drifted past every time the doors opened and shut. My name stayed where it was, inside my chest. I looked up to the digital clock on the west wall and looked away. When you hold your eyes on a clock like that, you start fighting with it. I checked the small notebook in my pocket. The paper was lined in a pale blue that went soft in the light. I had written the date and the time I left the apartment, the bus number, the fare, and a note about the weather because the cold had a personality today. Next to the fare, I wrote the amount again, small, so I could see it without reading. I wrote the cost of the bottle of water I had bought at the corner store. My handwriting was tight, leaning forward like it was walking into the wind with me. The woman called another cluster of names. I kept my mouth closed. When my turn finally seemed to open, I moved 1 step forward and put the envelope closer to me on the table. I said my name with a low voice that did not ask for anything extra. The woman moved her eyes from the screen to my face and then back down. Her fingers clicked over the keyboard, quick and light, like they were stepping stones across a stream. She said to wait a moment and pointed to the metal chairs without looking away from the monitor. I heard the words in the way people hear an instruction they have heard before. I took the envelope back with me and sat where the heater could not reach. The chair was cold through the coat. The cold was the kind that made you feel like the chair did not want you to stay. The lobby had a sound that was not one sound, but many small ones gathered together. A printer laying a sheet face down into a tray, rubber soles squeaking once, a tag on a zipper touching the plastic of a winter jacket, a child moving a picture book across a lap. Every now and then, the panel on the wall let out a beep and put a number in red where there had been another number in red. I put my thumb on the edge of the envelope and traced the wrinkle where the glue had tried to let go. Across from me, a bulletin board carried more papers than it should have. There were flyers for donations, a class about basic computer skills,
a small strip announcing holiday hours, and a map of the first floor with a yellow star where we were. There was a sheet about temporary digital access I had not seen before. It said something about Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3. I read the 3 steps with my lips closed, and when I finished, I read them again. The paper had a glossy look, like it had been printed on better stock than the rest. I thought about whether that mattered and decided it did, but I did not know how yet. I opened the envelope on my lap and slid the papers like I was counting bills I had to count exactly. I read the printed confirmation I had asked for on my last visit. The black toner had breaks in it where the printer needed someone to shake the cartridge, but the words could still be seen when you held the paper at the right angle. I added it to the right side of the envelope and made a left side for the items I thought I would show first. My hands like to put things in order. It calms them. When my hands are calm, sometimes the rest of me catches up. The screen gave up another set of names. A security guard walked through the room with a clipboard and checked badges, then doors, then trash cans. His shoes made a sound like a pencil tapping a desk, fast and light. The woman at the desk took a sip from a paper cup and set it down in the ring it had already made. Someone farther back tried to open a metal trash lid with gloves on and could not. The heater went quiet and left us with the naked buzz of the lights. I stood up before my knees could tell me not to. I took the envelope and went back to the desk. I used the same voice to say the same name as before. The woman's fingers did the same dance, but this time she also tilted her head. She asked me to wait again, and her hand made a slow circle in the direction of the chairs, like it had been trained to make that circle. I put the envelope under my arm, and I went back. When I sat, I set the envelope on my thigh and reached for my wallet. In the clear sleeve behind my identification card, there was a small piece of cardstock cut uneven on one side. I had written 3 words on it in blue ink to keep them where I could touch them. The edges were going soft from living in a pocket. I slid the card out to look at the words like a person checks a compass before turning. 3 words is a good number because you can say them on one breath. I did not say them out loud, but I felt my chest move like I had. A man wearing a maintenance shirt opened a door with a key and left it open behind him for a woman pushing a cart with reference books. The cart's wheel had a stiff spot that knocked every few inches. The lobby tasted like dust when the heater cut back on. I swallowed, and it tasted like the cup of coffee I had not been able to buy yet. I put the card back where it lived and slipped the notebook over it. The notebook had 3 lines for today, and I had already used 2. I drew the 3rd and left it open so I would not forget when I finally bought that coffee.
Time is heavier in rooms where names are called. You carry it like a bag you do not want to set down because the floor is dirty. I watch people come in and people go out, and I could tell by the way coats closed whether a person was leaving satisfied or the way they left when they were told to try again tomorrow. Some faces I recognized from other offices and other chairs. A man whose hat said a sports team I never followed pressed his lips in a line when he kept looking for a person who was habitually not looking for him. The woman with the stroller murmured to her baby in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the panel's beep. I ran my finger along the fold in the envelope and felt the groove where the paper had learned to bend. I checked my name on a paper I had brought just to see how the letters looked today. Sometimes the letters look like they know me, sometimes they do not. I put that paper under the others and put my hand on top like I could keep them from sliding away. The chair gave a little squeal when I shifted. I tightened my scarf because the heater had given up again. At some point, without meaning to, I started counting the seconds between the panel beeps. It was not consistent. The machine called when the people at the desk told it to. I tried to quit counting. It is a kind of clock fighting again. I took up a different task. I looked at the bulletin board and read the computer class flyer a second time, then a third. The words promised simple steps for beginners and small groups, a place where a person could learn where to click and how to save. The start time said late morning. The address said 2 blocks east. I put my eyes back on the panel. I stayed where I was. The man with the scarf left, and the door pulled a gust of cold across my shins. A new man came and brought his own air with him. The woman at the desk swapped places with a younger man whose hair stood in a careful wave and whose shirt collar caught the light like a razor. He read names differently. He hit the consonants like nails. The lobby changed in the way rooms change when one rhythm replaces another. I stood again. I went to the desk. I asked whether my name had been entered with the correct date. I had the envelope open and the printed piece ready because I believe in making the proof visible. The man took the paper, held it by one corner like it might smudge him, and looked at the screen long enough for the buzz of the lights to lean on my shoulders. He said to sit, that they would call the next set soon, and he put the paper down, not on the stack, but on the table itself. I took it back. It was my paper. It belonged with my other papers. I slid it into the left side where I was keeping the first out items, the ones easier to reach with cold hands. I sat again. The chair had learned my shape. My knees ached in a clean way, old lumber that still holds. I opened the notebook and wrote the time. I added a note for myself about the computer class flyer without making a promise. The day was still happening here. I told myself to be 2 blocks east another day. I closed the notebook around the pencil stub and kept the pencil there, like a tongue holding a letter in place. I put the envelope on top. Far away down the hall, a copier started, and I heard the thump of the lid, the warm sigh of the machine, and the small rattle as the completed pages fell into the mouth of the tray. A cart rolled past with a stack of returned books and the smell of 1,000 hands. The guard came back the other way and checked the door with a push that said he had pushed 1,000 doors. He looked at me once the way people look at someone to ask if they need anything without opening their mouth. I answered with nothing more than posture. I was fine. I was working. It is work to stay seated in a room that does not see you. It is work to keep a voice ready and clean for when the room remembers. I checked my wallet again for the small card because my thumb wanted to feel the edge. The words are not magic. Magic is the wrong size for places like this. The words are a tool like any other, something you can fit in your palm and put to the wood, then lift and look and place again, just a little to the side. The digital clock clicked to a number that made me think of lunch. I did not stand. I did not leave, even for the coffee I still had not earned in my notebook. A man in a navy coat took the chair 2 over from me and made the tired sound of a zipper that caught a string and had to be coaxed free. He kept his eyes on his boots. People do that here. It makes it easier to hold the day steady without losing any of it. Another set of names fell into the air. They were not mine, but one of them sounded like mine a little, and I felt a muscle somewhere in my chest move like a horse turning its head to listen for its name. I kept my breath in my throat until the sound was gone. Then I let it go slow and steady. I kept my hands where they were. I had learned to do that in other rooms. Hands quiet, papers ready, back straight, eyes soft enough to see a change when it comes. The heater came on and made the air smell like dust that had been sleeping. I let the smell pass through me and go on. I shifted the envelope from one thigh to the other so I would not numb one leg before the other. I checked the small crease at the top where the flap glued down. The glue was holding. That felt important in a quiet way. It is easier to keep your own glue holding when you can point to something else that holds. I thought of the flyer about temporary digital access and slid my eyes across the room to be sure it was still there. It was. The bright paper, the simple steps, the arrow pointing to where people like me could stand. I did not move toward it. My place was here. I let the knowledge sit like a coin in my pocket I would spend later. The woman with the stroller passed me again on her way to the door, and the baby's mitten brushed my sleeve of my coat in a soft, accidental way. The mitten felt like a small cloud. The child had no weight in their hand for a second, and then the weight returned. That is a way of saying the world gives, and then it gives back what it took, sometimes. The doors opened and made that big winter breath ride in again. The heater groaned and tried to throw a blanket over it. I leaned forward and made sure my feet were planted the way they needed to be if standing happened quickly. I put the envelope under my arm and let my other hand rest on my knee. A stack of new forms arrived on the desk in a man's arms. He set them down with the sound of paper hitting paper. The young man behind the counter looked at the forms, then at the screen, then up, and for a second his eyes were on me like a finger pressed to a page to mark the place. The panel beeped and a number jumped, the lobby holding its breath with me as the red digits decided who belonged to them next. The red digits blinked, held, and slid to the next number that belonged to someone else. The young clerk's eyes moved past me, and the feeling went with them. I kept my body ready the way you keep a door from drifting shut. The room exhaled. I let my shoulders come down one notch, not two. The flyer about temporary digital access sat on the bulletin board like a small window in a wall, and the window had an arrow pointing to other windows 2 blocks away. The clock said the morning was still young enough for a quick errand and still old enough to punish mistakes. I walked to the desk with my envelope pinned under my arm and asked if stepping out for a short turn would forfeit my place. The answer came in a practice sentence about current flow and not losing your turn if you return promptly. I thanked the sentence and asked for the next probable call window. The clerk named a band of minutes I could carry in my head like a handful of nails. Outside, the cold found the seam between my scarf and my collar and laid a finger there. The sidewalk held patches of thin frost that flashed when the sun knifed around the edge of a building. 2 blocks east was a building that knew what it was for. Rooms lined with folding chairs, tables with scuffs and clean edges, a small office with glass that had been wiped with a T-shirt. A sign taped to the door said Community Learning, Open, and nothing on the sign pretended to be fancier than that. I held the door with my shoulder for a woman carrying a slow box. The smell inside was burnt coffee and lemon cleaner, the kind of lemon that says, "See, we did our best with what we have." A staff badge on a lanyard stopped near me and asked what I needed, and I said the words I had: a primer, a place to sit, a way to keep my documents from running away from me. The staff appointed me to the room on the right with a paper taped up that said Basics, Money, Forms, Time. The room held a handful of people at different tables and a whiteboard with a date in the corner that matched the day I was living. I took a seat at the second table from the wall so I could look at the door if I needed to. The chair gave a skidding sound and decided to be stable. I set my envelope on the table and placed my notebook on top of it so I wouldn't mistake the order when the time to stand came. She moved like a person used to small rooms and the ways they resist, fluid, patient, and already in the middle of doing the work. She looked younger than the word facilitator and older than the word volunteer, and what I noticed first was that she was present without taking the oxygen. Her hair was pulled back in a way that said time was for other things. She laid out 3 stacks of handouts and a cup of pencils that had all been sharpened to the same point. When she spoke, her voice had weight, but no corners. She said we would work with what we carry every day: money that comes and goes, papers that prove who we are, words that sometimes make rooms more complicated than they need to be. I did not tell anyone that I had just come from a lobby where my name had not been called. You do not carry 2 rooms in your mouth at once if you can help it. I listened for instructions that could be folded and carried back with me. She talked about the simplest budget she knew, A split that fit in one line and 3 numbers. 10 for tomorrow, 10 for repair, 80 for today. She called it 10-10-80 and showed it using a single dollar bill and 3 plastic cups with masking tape labels. She said some days the tens are dimes or pennies, and that still counts when you count with integrity. She said the numbers are less important than the motion, a habit that moves even when it can only move small. She moved to the next table and laid down a 1-page sheet with boxes. It was a checklist with plain names: ID, proof of address, last protocol number, last receipt, open questions. She said the sheet was meant to be filled out before you go to a counter, not after. She pointed to the last line that said, "Bring a pencil." People forget pencils. People forget that their own handwriting is evidence. She showed how to clip that sheet to the front of an envelope and how to shift it to the back when you're done so you can see progress without thinking too hard about how to feel it.
Then she stood near the whiteboard and drew a small map, a square for the library, a rectangle for City Hall, a circle for the clinic, a triangle for the market. She drew lines between them with little arrows like bus routes and wrote QG in the square for the library. HQ, she said, not because you need soldiers, but because you need a base. Computers, printers, power outlets, a clock on the wall, and a place where people are used to being quiet. She said a person could make the library their headquarters for a season. Print the form, read it, highlight what you need to ask about, then walk the line to the office that will put a stamp on the right corner. Start at the square, return to the square. She talked about the library as a place where time changes its posture, where being still is not the same as being stuck. She passed me and left a small index card on my table. Her writing was quick and straight, each line marching. She wrote 3 words I knew how to say on one breath. She pointed to the empty back and said I could add anything else I wanted to hold. I added the plan for the day: library, community center, back to library, print, ask, record. I pressed the card flat with my palm until the paper warmed, then slipped it behind the plastic sleeve in my wallet so that if the wallet ever fell open, the words would be the first thing that saw the light. She returned with another sheet and called it Simple Language. She said this one was for the mouth. The rules were as clean as a broom. Use short sentences. Ask to see where it is written. Repeat the instruction back in your own words and ask if you repeated it right. Do not stack more than 1 question at a time. She said short sentences are not less intelligent. They are less likely to be ignored. She said we are allowed to make room slower so that dignity can enter and find a chair. I traced the bullet points with a finger so I would memorize with my hand as well as with my eyes. Then she wrote 15 on the board and drew a small clock face beside it with 3 marks at the quarter hours. She called it a daily 15. 15 minutes for the thing you least want to touch but need to touch to move your life forward. She said this is how you build days that don't spill. You set aside the quarter hour and you don't argue with it. She showed how it fits into 10-10-80. 15 minutes to save a fee, 15 minutes to find a missing form, 15 minutes to make a call when you'd rather not be a voice on hold. 1 quarter hour, not forever. A person can climb a staircase if the steps are shallow and repeat. The room made soft noises that meant people were absorbing and not arguing. Paper sliding, pencils writing, chairs adjusting to new weights. The fluorescent light hummed like a refrigerator. I flipped open my notebook to the page for the day and gave it a header that would make sense when I looked at it next week. What I did, what time it took, what paper proves it. The proof line felt new on my tongue and better than the word hope because it did not ask for promises. It asked for a paperclip. She walked through the tables and came back with a handful of clipboards and a stack of manila envelopes, clean, no scars yet. She handed them to whoever had arrived with plastic bags or open folders that spilled. I had my brown envelope from the library, softened at the edges, so I did not take a fresh one. But I did take a paper clip from the cup and put it on the top left of my checklist because it looked like a way to keep the day from curling up on itself. I moved my old envelope close to the new tools. The old envelope did not look offended. It had an image to live up to now.
She rested a hand near my table and asked us to try the moves right there in the room, so the moves would live in our hands before we left. I put my checklist on top of the envelope and filled it with what I had. ID? Yes. Proof of address? Yes. A piece of mail with my name and last month's date. Last protocol number? Yes. Folded, but legible. Last receipt? Yes. Bus fare scribbled on a small tear-off and a water receipt from the corner store, printed faint with a paper feed that ran hot. Open questions? Yes. One about temporary digital access while a renewal is in review, and one about the list that did not say my name this morning. I ticked the boxes and drew a line through the blank ones I didn't need so I wouldn't get greedy with forms. She set a timer for 3 minutes and told us to stand up, sit down, and stand again with the envelope pinned under our arm and the checklist visible, as if we were moving between counters and chairs. It felt foolish for the first 2 seconds, and then it felt fine. The envelope learned what it meant to be carried without sliding. My shoulders learned there was a place for them to be that did not apologize. The card in my wallet made a light rectangle against my hip. The timer chimed and the room reset. She concluded with what she called an HQ loop. Start in a quiet room with power and printers. Prepare. Walk to the place that stamps. Ask, confirm, collect. Return to HQ. File and record. She said this loop protects against being sent in circles by other people's loops. The square on the map matters because you pick it. Pick a square that respects you. Put your name in it with your own hand. She erased the board down to a corner note. 15 minutes set aside every day, even if it is the only thing that happens that day with your name on it. My chest answered to that note with a feeling like a steady step down a stair that has been loose for years and is suddenly secure. I thought of the library's bulletin board. I thought of the square with the star on the map and how the arrow pointed back to it. I pictured the lobby and the bank smell of radiator dust. The thin light through the glass on the street door looked like the kind that keeps appointments, not the kind that comes when it pleases. I slid my notebook into the envelope and set the pencil in the spiral so it wouldn't escape. I checked the clock and counted the minutes I had told the desk I would be gone. I counted them again to be sure. The folder of handouts made a neat packet when I folded it. I added it to the right side of the envelope, topmost, with the checklist clipped and visible. She stopped beside me one more time and placed a tiny strip of opaque tape on the inside of my envelope where the flap was thinning. She said nothing. The gesture was enough. Keep what holds you holding. The tape felt like a promise you make to tools when they've served you. I pressed the tape flat and felt the warmth transfer from finger to paper. I slid my wallet out and looked at the card again, then turned it over and wrote HQ, Library, under the 3 words. I wrote the day and the time once more in the notebook. I let the pencil dot the page where I would later write what I had done and how long it took. I closed the notebook carefully, like you set a lid on a pot that will still simmer. I stood and returned my chair to where it had started. The back edge of it touched the table and made the smallest sound, a polite cough. I nodded to the room. A gust of cold met me at the door and crowded the lemon cleaner back into the corners. I pulled my scarf higher and set out.
The sidewalk felt less like a place you pass and more like a place you move on. A bus flared its brakes and settled into the curb. A man set a milk crate down and reshaped its fingers around it. The sky had the hard brightness you only get when the air is honest about the cold.
When I came back to the library doors, the glass gave 2 soft taps as the air pressure shifted. The heater coughed awake like an old friend trying to clear its throat. The lobby looked the same, but I fit into it differently. I went to the desk and said I had returned. The young clerk looked at me and nodded like a person who recognizes the shape of a circle closed. He pointed to the chairs and said the window of minutes we had discussed was still the window I was in. He said callings would resume after a short adjustment. I said thank you and meant it. I sat and set the envelope on my thigh, checklist up, pencil hovering like a compass needle. I took the index card from my wallet and pressed it to the face of the envelope. 3 words on one breath. HQ written below in my block letters. My hands remembered the 3-minute drill and placed the papers. I put the bus fare note and the water receipt where I would file them later. I looked at the flyer on the bulletin board again. It did not wink or glow. It stood there like a sign, doing its job. I decided that after the library work, I would walk back and sign up for the computer class, because signing up was not the same as finishing, and signing up fit inside 15 minutes. The panel beeped. The red digits jumped, then held. The clerk took a new stack of forms from a colleague and set them beside the monitor. He glanced into the room and let his eyes settle on faces one at a time, as if memory were a machine he was turning the crank on. I lifted my chin slightly and kept my shoulders where they belonged. A woman with a stroller found a seat again, and the baby's mitten brushed my coat as she passed. The mitten left a small, damp mark that disappeared almost at once, as marks do when heat finds them. Under the table, my knee bounced once, and I told it no. I touched the corner of the index card and felt the blunt edge of the cardstock and the slight give where it had been cut with scissors not made for such fine work. I breathed in the smell of the room, paper, coats, dust that had seen other winters, and breathed out through my nose so I would not move the envelope with my breath. The guard walked his slow line and checked the door that had been checked earlier. The rhythm of the lobby came back to me like a song whose words you do not know, only the beat. The clerk looked at his screen, then into the room again, then down at the stack of forms in a way that told me he was somewhere in the middle of deciding. My phone gave a small vibration against my hip, a single punctuation mark, and the screen lit my pocket for an instant with the same red glow that lived on the panel. I took out the phone, turned it so only I could see, and saw the notification that the queue was moving faster than the last 15 minutes. I set the phone face down on the envelope to keep my eyes where they needed to be. The clock on the west wall clicked over to a new minute, and the sound of it seemed larger than it should have been. The heater took a breath and held it. A man near the door stood and then sat again when the number was not his. I set my feet under me the way I had practiced at the community center, planted and ready without showing the effort. I checked the checklist at a glance: ID, proof of address, last protocol, last receipt, open questions, and slid the envelope a fingertip closer to the edge of my knee so I could rise without scraping the chair. The panel beeped, and the red numbers changed again, and the young clerk drew in a breath as if to shape a sound with my name in it. The breath the clerk drew in broke into another name that was not mine. It left a clean space in my chest, like a shelf where something would go later. I let my shoulders settle one notch and kept the envelope on my thigh the way I had practiced. The panel's red numbers blinked and slid, and the lobby shook its shoulders back into its rhythm, boots, stroller wheels, a cough too big for a paper mask. I waited for the next moment I could ask a human question that had an answer attached to it.
When the pause between callings stretched to the length of a quiet song, I stood and walked to the desk. I used short words and showed the checklist pinned to the envelope to keep my mouth from adding layers that would not help. I asked if I could record that I had been here at these times on this day while the renewal waited its turn. The clerk's eyes tracked the clip and the boxes. He printed a tiny slip with a timestamp and a line that said present, lobby, and pushed it across the table with 2 fingers. The paper came warm and smelled faintly of toner and hot plastic. I placed it in the top corner of my envelope, under the clip so it would not wander. A small proof makes a room different. He added that a supervisor would review morning errors and that the system was catching up. I thanked the sentence without asking it to promise more than it could. Then I kept my place by the chairs long enough to see that the next numbers belonged to people who were already standing at the turnstile. I did not want to be stubborn when flexible would get me farther. The flyer with the small window on the bulletin board still pointed 2 blocks east. I decided to use the time the lobby could not use of me. The cold outside put its hands on my face and held them there. I tucked my scarf into my chin and turned toward a bank I knew 4 blocks away because a bus driver once told me the bank in that direction had longer hours and shorter tempers. The sidewalks had that thin frost that makes everything tick underfoot. A truck hissed at a stoplight and left a ribbon of exhaust that looked solid until I walked through it. I kept the envelope under my arm and the index card in my wallet like a small engine. HQ was the square I would return to, but there were lines to walk first. The bank's glass doors opened me into a lobby that smelled like fabric softener and pen caps. A greeter with a name tag shaped like a leaf asked if I had an appointment. I told him I had a question and proof that it was a good question. He smiled out of habit and handed me a tablet to sign in. I used the corner of my fingertip because my nails are cut close. I used my short words to fill the box that asked for the reason, fee waiver question. It let me finish the sentence without scolding me for not using the exact phrase the bank likes. I sat on a chair that was too deep for a back that has learned to work. I leaned forward to make the chair fit me and clipped my checklist to the top of the envelope again. A young man with a tie with tiny sailboats called my last name and added a sir to it. The sir did not feel like a costume here. It felt like a tool that keeps things smooth. His desk was a rectangle with a plant that did not need much light. He asked how he could help me, and I put the document I had collected last month on the table. I asked to see the written table of fees and to know if the no monthly fee account described there was one a person like me could open without a cell phone plan wrapped around it. He brought up a screen, then opened a drawer and took out a printed sheet that smelled like it had been in the drawer longer than a week. He turned it so it faced me and laid a finger on the line that mattered. He said the bank had an account for seniors that cost nothing monthly if the balance stayed above a number that was lower than the rumor on the street, and if I accepted paperless statements. I said paperless was fine as long as I could print them at HQ when I needed to. He smiled, and the plant seemed to move toward the light a fraction.
I kept my question small enough to answer. I asked whether opening the account would close the old one without leaving a trailing fee. He said no, they would move the funds and close it as a courtesy. I asked if he could print a confirmation letter today that said the monthly fee would be 0 if the conditions were met, not simply explain it out loud. He paused, then nodded, and said he could generate a summary. He printed it, and the paper made the sigh I like to hear. He stamped the bottom with the small square stamp that emboldens ink. The stamp left a clean edge. I put the sheet into the envelope's bank side, topmost. I wrote the time in my notebook, the word bank, and the words fee waiver doc in my tight forward hand. My pencil left a whisper across the page, and the whisper felt like stacking a small stone in the right pile. He asked if there was anything else. I said there was one more thing, and I kept it simple. I asked if he would highlight on the printed fee table the 2 lines that most hurt people who don't know to ask: overdraft and paper statement charges, and if he would sign his name next to the highlights. He did the thing people do when they are deciding whether to break a small unspoken rule, and then he drew the highlighter once, twice, and wrote his name beside it. He said the bank prefers to email these things, but for today he could do this. I said I understood. I put that paper 1 layer deep in the envelope and clipped it again. I thanked him with a voice that had room in it, not the rushed voice of someone afraid the room will take the thanks away before it lands. When I stepped out, the sky had shifted into the kind of brightness that bites through cloth. I walked the triangle to the market because I wanted the numbers in my notebook to reflect how small things join up. The sliding door opened with a dry whisper. The market smelled like oranges and perfume samples that never find the right wrist. I got a basket and went to the aisle with rice. A big bag pretended to be cheaper by wearing a sticker that said value. I did the math on the price tag for unit weight. The smaller bag won. I put it in the basket and wrote the unit price in my notebook next to the shelf price so that my hand would remember the trick I had played on the trick the store had played on me. I bought 2 other small things I needed for the week, bread and beans, and the total came to less than what my head had guessed. At the register, a cashier with nails done in a winter pattern of tiny snowflakes slid my items like they were sleeping children and handed me the receipt with the carefulness of a librarian. I put the receipt in the envelope under Market and wrote the total next to the time. I drew a small check mark next to the tally because I like the feeling of checking when the check is earned. On the way out, I bought a coffee from a machine because I wanted to write the number where the number belongs. The coffee tasted like cardboard that had been blasted by a bean, but the heat went straight into my chest and told me I had done something steady. I wrote the amount in the 3rd line of the day like the board had told me to. I closed the notebook and felt the weight of it change by a gram. That is the kind of change I can live with.
The wind came up hard at the crosswalk and tried to lift my scarf off my neck like a trickster. I pressed the scarf down and crossed. I wanted to be back in the library lobby when the numbers matched the window the clerk had named. The doors opened, and the heater's old cough wrapped around my ears. The lobby looked the same, but when I walked back in, the desk man's head lifted the way a person's head lifts when a circle closes. He asked for my name and pointed to a chair I had not noticed before because it sat half a row back and had a line of light on it. I sat there and put the envelope on my thigh and the notebook on top and the index card where my eye could land on it without my hand moving. I checked my checklist: ID, proof of address, last protocol, last receipt, open questions. I put the market receipt next to the water and bus slips so I could file them in the right sleeve later. I breathed in the smell of old coats and new paper and let it find a level place inside me. The security guard was different now, a woman with a bun that looked like it could hold up a tent. She walked the room and checked at doors with a knuckle rap that was soft and decisive. A volunteer with a badge that said "Ask Me Anything" paused at my row, glanced at my envelope with the clip and boxes, and said in a half-whisper that the station on the left could help with digital access if the renewal took time. She tapped the corner of my envelope once with her finger in a way that sounded like approval. I told her I saw the flyer and would ask when I had the next human breath that belonged to me. She smiled with her eyes like people do when their mouth is busy with rules. A woman I recognized from other rooms sat down near me and waved a paper that looked like a request for proof of residence. She asked me gently if this was the right paper for a situation like hers, and I told her, in short sentences, what I knew to be true and what I had only heard. I repeated the instruction I had been given earlier about asking to see where it was written.
She nodded and said she would try that line at the counter and not add other lines that would make the moment heavy. We went back to watching the panel with our shoulders forward and our eyes soft. It helps to have a neighbor who is trying the same kind of day. The panel beeped and the numbers climbed in steps that were not mine yet. When the pause came long enough for a human to move in it, I stood and approached the left station the volunteer had pointed out. I asked, short and simple, about a temporary digital access path while renewals were in review. A librarian with silver hair that looked like a field in winter and glasses that lived low on her nose said there was a way. She asked me for my ID and the last confirmation slip. I handed them across. Her keyboard made the soft tick that comes from someone who has worked with both manual typewriters and computers and knows how to borrow the best of both habits. She handed me a sheet that explained how to set up the access at a public terminal if I did not have a phone that could carry the app, and another sheet explaining the hours when a staff member could help. She pointed to the line about a 30-day window and circled it with a pen that had dried a little. The pen made a quiet scratching sound that felt like sand smoothing a board. She said I could sign up for a 20-minute help slot today or take the paper and do it myself. I looked at the time on the wall and the time in my notebook. I chose to do it myself because the panel numbers were getting close to something that might carry my name in them. She nodded like a person who enjoys a good decision even when it has nothing to do with her. I put the sheets into the library side and added a small note in my notebook that said, "Temp access steps, circled 30 days, ask for help if stuck." I wrote it in block letters so I could read it later with eyes that might be tired.
Back in the chair, I pulled the index card out and rubbed my thumb over the 3 words, because the oil in skin is good for paper, and paper is good for memory. I put the card under the clip for a moment so I could see it without opening the wallet again and again. The word constancy looked different in the light of a room where a person's name either exists or does not. I decided that constancy here meant staying present without making a spectacle of it. Presence with proof. I put the card back in the wallet and checked the checklist again for the pleasure of seeing boxes that had squares inside them. Then I took a short step to the help desk at the back to ask for a stamp. It feels small to ask for a stamp until you need one. The volunteer behind the desk wore a sweater that made a soft sound when she moved. She took the tiny present slip the clerk had printed earlier and added a date stamp with the heavier machine on her counter, the kind you have to press flat to make the ink honest. The sound came up through my fingers when she returned the slip to me. I slipped it between 2 copper paper clips in my envelope so that when the day wanted to slide, the little piece of paper would not. The red numbers jumped, paused, and jumped again. They had entered my neighborhood. I sat 2 inches closer to the edge of my chair and let my knees know what we might do soon. A neighbor I have in my building, a man named Joe who keeps his keys on the carabiner like a mountain climber, walked in and waved with 2 fingers. He whispered that the bus had slipped on ice 1 stop back and everyone had breathed at the same time. He asked if this was the right line. I showed him with my hand without turning my head too much because I did not want my name to arrive and find me looking away from it. Joe patted my shoulder in the way people do when they're trying to give you a coat and know they cannot. I looked down at my notebook and added a line for how long the bank had taken and circled the word highlight because it felt rare and worth seeing again. The pencil had grown short and smooth, a little like me. I thought about the 10-10-80 and wondered if I could put time in those cups the way she had put money. 10 minutes for tomorrow, 10 minutes for repairs, 80 for today. I wrote that in the margin because new thoughts deserve to be written down like names. A thought can run away faster than a fox if you do not catch it on paper. Somewhere behind the desk, a printer roused itself into a noisy berth. The clerk with the careful hair surfaced from his screen and looked into the room. He scanned in a way that sought something and not just anything. I felt the breath in my chest move to a place I could hold it without cheating.
The silver-haired librarian reappeared at his elbow and said something behind her hand, and he nodded in a way that meant a point had been placed on a map and a line was moving toward it. He took a batch of forms and squared their edges against the desk like a person who likes his piles dignified. He looked at the monitor, then at us, then back at the paper. He lifted a single form just off the pile and held it like it had weight. I set my feet and slid my envelope a finger's width toward my knee so standing would be a movement and not an argument. The heater sang a low note and the door gave a small sigh and the panel did not move for a long breath. Then a voice near the turnstile said my last name cleanly from the throat and added my first name so there would be no mistake. And a woman stepped forward from the inner room with a stapled packet raised just high enough that I could see the corner of the stamp catching the light.
The packet in her hand had the weight of paper that has been told to matter. I stood, and it felt like I had trained for that one motion all morning. She said my first and last name again, the way you say a word when you want to be sure it reaches the right ears without bouncing. She led me to the side counter, where a metal pin on the chain waited with its little circle of worn wood below it. The packet held a summary of what had happened so far and what could happen next. The top page named the morning error and called it a technical issue. The second page laid out the temporary digital access steps in plain boxes. The third page was the part I kept looking at without meaning to. It said, "Renewal under review," and below it in calm type, "Expected decision within 30 days, with provisional digital access available immediately upon completion of steps 1 through 3. My breath found an even height in my chest. She pointed at the place where my name was spelled correctly in 3 different spots, and at a box I could initial to say I had received the information. I initialed in a hand I had learned in a different decade. The pen dug a little too deep into the paper, like it was trying to plant a seed. She handed me a small slip with a timestamp stating that on this day, at this hour, I had been given the packet and the path forward. I put the slip under my clip, top left. I asked for one more thing in short words. Could she print the page about eligibility for provisional access that some people say is only in the app? She smiled with half her mouth and said she could. The printer behind the desk warmed and sighed and gave me a 4th page that showed the same instructions in a flat voice. I tucked it under the others. The packet became a stack you could knock on. She circled the help desk hours for the week and slid a pale yellow card across to me that said "Set up support," with a line for a name and a line for a time. She asked whether I wanted to hold a 20-minute slot later that afternoon. I told her I could do the steps on my own. I wanted to work to live in my hands. She nodded and said to come back if the steps argued with me. I thanked her with the kind of thanks you give to people who don't try to win points on you. Then I went back to my chair and laid the packet in the envelope's library sleeve. I felt the envelope's weight shift against my thigh. It was the kind of shift a carpenter knows when a frame starts to square. I took my notebook and made a page called "What I Did, How Long It Took, Proof." Library packet received, 10 minutes. Provisional access printouts, 2 minutes. Time-stamped slip, 1 minute. I drew tidy boxes next to each line so future me could put a check inside. Then I wrote a bigger line across the page and made 3 columns under it with the little abbreviations I had carried from the room with the whiteboard. 30, 60, 90. Under 30, I wrote library renewal decision and the expected date window, counting out the days with the calendar in my head, and then counting again to check myself. Under 60, I wrote computer basics course, enrollment and attendance, and a note to talk to the staff about a certificate page if they have one. Under 90, I wrote bills and statements audit, with a line to check my account's no-fee status each month and print confirmation. I pressed the page flat with my palm, like it was a map that needed to learn how to lie still. Before leaving the desk area, I took 2 copies of the temporary access instructions, one for the envelope and one I could mess up with pencil notes at the terminal. The terminal surface was clean in the way that means hands have been wiped off it all morning. I followed the boxes, and the software asked me for the same things the paper said it would ask for. I gave it the information and said yes when it asked if I wanted to print a receipt noting the activation. The print was light but legible. The paper came out warm, and I held it flat until it thought it was a board. I clipped that to the packet and wrote the time in my notebook. Provisional access active, 8 minutes. Proof, receipt.
A volunteer I hadn't seen before. A young man with a wool cap that kept sliding up his hair like it wanted to get off his head came by and asked if I needed help with the login. I said I had gotten through and held up the receipt. He gave me a thumbs up and whispered that the printers jam if you hit 'em hard, but behave if you go slow. I laughed without making noise because slow is the only speed I had left for anything that mattered. I logged out and put the terminal in the sort of order I appreciate finding. On my way out, the clerk with the careful hair nodded at me and said, "See you soon, mister," and then my last name, the whole thing, all the syllables. The nod had weight without performance. The panel beeped behind me and a new number turned red. I didn't look back at it. I had what I needed to build the next part. The doors breathed, and the old radiator gave a throat clear to chase me out. I took the long way home to pass the church. The day had the bright, thin sound of a week leaning toward Thanksgiving. The church bulletin board by the side door had new flyers, the reading group schedule for the winter months, the food drive list, a simple sheet with a box you could write your name in if you wanted to help fold programs on Sunday mornings. I took one of the reading group schedules and slid it under Community in the envelope, a sleeve I had made on the walk by creasing the paper at a new angle. Inside the side door, a woman I knew from the early service was taping stacks of programs with green painter's tape. She looked up, saw me, and said my name, in the way people say the name of a neighbor they expect to see where they see him. She asked if I had a minute to help fold, and I said I had 15. She laughed when I said 15, like I had said the punchline to a joke. We folded quietly for 14, and then she handed me a single program and said, "This one's clean. Take it." She tucked it into my envelope with her hand like she was placing a note into a pocket before winter. At the corner market, I went in to check the price per unit on laundry detergent because last time I had rushed and made a mistake. The cashier with the snowflake nails recognized me and said that the small bottle with the bonus sticker was still the one to avoid. I checked, and she was right. I wrote the unit prices in my notebook, and when I finished, she said she liked seeing the little book come out. She said it made her want to start one for herself, not for the dollars only, but for the days. She said that and then blushed like she had said something that might make me think too much of it. I told her a little book needs only a pencil to be true. She smiled and waved me out with a receipt I didn't need that time. I took it anyway and slid it into market. Back at the apartment, I put the envelope on the small table by the window where the light works in winter. The table is scarred from jobs long finished. I opened the cabinet where the cereal lives and took down the box I had saved, the one sturdy box that once held paper. I laid a strip of masking tape across the front and wrote library, bank, courses, bills, community in block letters. I set the envelope inside the box and watched the box swallow the morning whole. I sat and drank a glass of water because the cleaner in the community center had taught me to do that even when the air inside is dry. I opened the notebook to the page with 30, 60, 90 and drew a small square at the top right. I wrote HQ Library. I wrote a line under the 30 that said, "Return with packet and ID and proof of address."
I wrote a line under the 60 that said, "Class sign up, ask for attendance sheet with printed name." I wrote a line under the 90 that said, "Collect monthly no-fee confirmation print and clip."
The next day began early because some days require one extra step to get all the steps in. My body knows how to wait when a day has work that can be counted. I did the 15 minutes on the thing I least wanted to touch. I sat with the pile of bills I had been ignoring and wrote the amounts and due dates in the notebook in fresh columns. I called one number and followed the machine's voice to an option for older accounts and asked for a statement to be emailed because I needed it to print later. The email arrived like a little flag in my inbox, and I printed it at the community center for a small fee I wrote down. The paper came out warm, and the words lined up like soldiers in daylight. I placed it in bills and clipped it so it couldn't go walking. At the community center, the woman with the straight handwriting ran the computer basics orientation again. This time, there were fewer people, and the sound in the room was softer. I signed the sheet in a clean line and wrote my name carefully so the printer would recognize me when it printed certificates later, if certificates were a thing here. I asked if there was a completion print they gave out. She said not exactly, but they could print the attendance log with your name on the line for that day if you wanted. I said I wanted. When the session ended, she printed the log, and my name looked good on paper next to the word attended. It felt like a small flag planted in the ground that is mine. I filed it under courses and wrote the time in my notebook. At the bus stop afterward, the wind flipped a paper cup down the sidewalk like a fish. A man in a heavy coat with the bus company logo held his hand up to me in the friendly way and said he'd seen me on this route all week at the same hour. He asked how the seats treat my knees and told me which times a day have the least standards so I could get a seat without looking like I was asking for it. He said the pass for seniors was cheaper down the line at the transit desk if you bring ID and proof of age, and that they would give you a paper pass that works like a piece of dignity that you can tap. I nodded and wrote the details down in my book: window hours, desk location, documents needed. He nodded at the book like it was a person, then pulled the bus up so we could climb. Sunday came with its warm wood smell. I went to the early service, and after the benediction, a man with a clipboard asked if I had interest in the reading group they were building for winter. He had seen me take the schedule off the board earlier in the week. He said they needed one person to keep a simple attendance and bring the sheet back each month so the church knew how many cookies to put out. He said the job pays in cookies. I said I could do that, if the sheet could be printed with the dates on top so my eyes had an anchor. He said of course. He wrote my name on the clipboard and spelled it slow out loud while he did it. The sound of it lived with me for a long minute. He handed me a small card with the first date circled. The card had a grain in the paper you could feel with your thumb. I put it in community with the program from the folding day. Back at the library, the silver-haired librarian saw me and said welcome back like we had a standing appointment. I told her I had completed the provisional setup. She said good and asked if I wanted to test the login at a terminal or just hold the paper until I needed it. I said I wanted to test once and then fold it away. We logged in together. It worked the way paper said it would. She printed a one-line confirmation showing last login and time. We stapled it to the packet so the proof lived in the neighborhood of the proof that made it. A station farther down buzzed and jammed, and she moved to help there, leaving me with the small, warm square of a successful act.
On the way out, the young clerk handed me a printed sheet without me asking. It held the new schedule for the next week's desk staffing and help hours, with his initials on the bottom because he had typed it. He said it could help people like me choose windows that move. I told him I'd add it to my planning page. He said good because the printer makes better hours than the roomer does.
The phrase made me laugh in my chest. I clipped the sheet over the packet and wrote the word staffing hours in the margin of my notebook with the time. I stopped at the transit desk midweek. The desk smelled like rubber and paper and the faint metallic lift of coins. I had my ID and a proof of age and my book with the times written in it. The clerk there set a camera to my height and asked me to hold my head steady. I did. The machine made a sound like a small zipper. He handed me a paper pass with my name tucked into it, printed tight. It felt like a piece of quiet authority. He said to keep the receipt for a week in case the system wanted to argue about the activation. I saved it in transport and drew a thin line in my notebook to remind me to test the pass at the turnstile that afternoon. When I tapped it, the gate opened with a short acceptance tone. I wrote that sound down too, because it felt like something you could forget if you weren't careful. The tone a gate makes when a piece of paper says yes. By the end of the week, my little stack of proofs looked like a brick. Not heavy, but resolved. The brown envelope had learned to carry the weight without bending. The index card in my wallet was shinier at the corners from being pressed by my fingers. At night, I made a habit that matched the 3 columns under the 30, 60, 90. I spent 15 minutes setting tomorrow. I set out the papers for the next day's errands under a glass that had belonged to my mother. The glass with the chip my thumb finds. Because a chip becomes a kind of guidance for a hand when you learn where it is. I added any new receipts to the right sleeves, wrote times and little checks in the book, and moved the pen clip to the next blank page so my morning hand would not wander. Small recognitions collected the way people collect stamps by accident. The market cashier said my name like she'd been practicing on the walk from the bus stop to the store. Joe from the building asked if I wanted to put my name on the sign-up for corridor sweeping rotation so the landlord would stop knocking on random doors in the evening. He said he wrote mine for every second Thursday and showed me the paper, and I said that was fine as long as the broom works. The clerk at the library told me which printer made darker prints when the toner was low. The volunteer in the wool cap nodded at my checklist and said it was the best he'd seen. And then he caught himself and said one of the best, laughing like he'd stepped on a line and corrected himself. In church the next Sunday, I handed back the reading group attendance sheet with 2 neat signatures from the first gathering, mine and the woman who runs the soup pot. The man with the clipboard thanked me like he had saved him a drive back to the building. He handed me a new sheet with next month's dates and a stack of extra programs because he said sometimes people like to read them again at home where there's less choir. He shook my hand and squeezed once and looked me in the eye in the way that means a person can be trusted with a paper.
At home, I made a small place for all of it to live. I lined the box with an old T-shirt so the papers wouldn't slide, then set the envelopes in their order. In the lid, I taped a short checklist: ID, proof of address, last protocol, last receipt, open questions, packet. I wrote return to HQ under that, and then the address of the library, even though I have known it longer than I know some relatives. I like the look of printed letters in a straight line. It tells a brain you prepared.
At the end of the second week, I went back to the computer class and asked them to print the attendance page again. My name sat next to the date in clean type. I held the paper in both hands and then slid it into courses. The instructor with the straight handwriting asked if I wanted to help set up chairs next time for 10 minutes. I said yes, because it fits in 15. She marked my name with a small star and said that meant something only in that room. I like that. Not every star is for showing off. Some are for pointing you to a chair you set up yourself. The days climbed in a quiet stack. I kept my 10, 10, 80 for the dollars I could name. 10 for tomorrow, 10 for repairs, 80 for the day. I put a dime in a jar one day because that's what the day had room for. I wrote it down and checked the box, not because the amount would change anything, but because the motion would. For the repairs time, I fixed the loose hinge on the cabinet that throws the cereal box at me when it feels dramatic. For the today time, I walked to the library on a day I didn't need to ask for anything so the HQ would not forget my shape. One afternoon, the mail brought a letter with a window that showed my name properly spaced. The paper inside used careful gray lines and asked me to confirm that my address had not changed, that my phone was correct, that the name on the ID I had shown matched the name they had in their system. I ticked each box with the pen that writes a clean blue and put the letter back in its envelope. I walked it to the post slot down the block because I believe in handing decisions back to their boxes sooner than later. When I dropped it through, it made the weighty sound of mail that knows its path. I wrote that down. A week later, I walked past the church and the woman from the program table called to me by my full name like I was a student in a class. She said they had added my name to the announced list as the contact person for the winter reading group. She showed me the bulletin proof with lines of names and mine among them. It looked like any other line of type. I stood there a second longer than I needed to so the small moment could sit. By the time the third Sunday rolled around, my box was half full and my book was half used. The card in my wallet had softened in a way that made it stronger. The traffic of the city carried Thanksgiving in its shoulders. People in coats moved turkeys like grievances and pies like apologies. In the library, the silver-haired librarian lifted her hand to me as she walked by, and the young clerk with the careful hair slid me a new help hour sheet without being asked. He had underlined a window that he said was quiet if a person preferred quiet. I thanked him. He said, "Good luck with your 30-day window," and then he corrected himself and said, "Not luck, just time." I kept the rhythm. Morning 15, 10-10-80 written in my tidy forward hand, small proofs made, larger proofs filed. My steps to and from HQ felt like ropes I was braiding. The rope grew stronger the more strands it had, even if each strand was thin. On a Tuesday with a clean sky, I opened the box and laid everything on the table in their sleeves. Library packet with provisional receipt and last login print. Bank fee waiver letter with highlighted lines and signature. 2 market receipts with unit prices noted. Transit pass receipt with activation date. Course attendance logs. Church reading group card. Church program. Community center handout. Checklist on the lid. Index card from the wallet laid on top. I named each item in my head and then named its place. Order is a kind of quiet that builds its own walls. When I put it all back, the box closed without argument. The clock on my wall clicked to the new hour, and the sound was clean. I took my notebook and flipped to the 30-60-90 page. In the 30 column, I drew a small empty box next to the line that said renewal outcome. I wrote the expected date range one more time and circled it so the circle could hold the air between today and that day. Then I wrote in calm letters across the bottom edge of the page the words I wanted to carry with me to the counter when the day came. Present, prepared, patient. I set the notebook on top of the box, and for a long breath, I watched the winter light warm the cardboard and pick out the grain in the tape where I had written the labels. Then I stood, washed a cup, set it to dry, and put my coat on a chair where it could rest before I asked it to go out again. The morning I chose was inside the window I had circled twice. I woke before the alarm because some days carry their own bell. I drank water, stretched my fingers until the small tightness in the joints let go, and set the table the way a person sets a stage for a scene he hopes will go right. The box with the mask and tape labels waited where the winter light made the cardboard look patient. I lifted the lid and named what I touched. the way a carpenter names his tools before he climbs a ladder. Library packet, provisional access receipt, last login print, ID, proof of address, reading group schedule, bank fee waiver letter, transit pass receipt, market receipts, course attendance. I clipped the checklist to the front of the brown envelope and slid the index card from my wallet to read the 3 words without saying them. I wrote the date and the hour on the 30, 60, 90 page and drew a small square beside renewal outcome. I wanted to put a check there. I did not put it yet. Outside, the air held the taste of a coin. A bus threw its breath across the curb and bowed its head. I rode 2 stops because my knees had things to do later and I wanted them fresh. The doors of the library breathed the day into me. The old radiator cleared its throat like it was reading from a page it knew by heart. I stepped on to the waxed floor and went to the desk, the envelope under my arm, the checklist facing up like a flag that does not need to wave to be seen. The clerk with the careful hair was there, and so was the silver-haired librarian. The volunteer in the wool cap stacked handouts into a neat fan like a deck he was ready to deal. I said my first and last name. The clerk looked at the screen the way a person looks at a recipe he has made before and still respects. He nodded once and asked for my ID and packet. His tone had no corners. I handed the packet across and kept my hands quiet on the edge of the desk. He scrolled, then reached for a printer button with a motion that looked practiced and careful. Paper moved behind the counter with the sound of an animal that has learned to live in a machine. The librarian stepped closer, not to rush him, but to witness. The volunteer drifted a little, as if attention had weight. The printer gave an extra breath, then laid a card on the output tray. The card was thick enough to resist the bend and thin enough to live in a wallet. My last name looked like it belonged to me there. The letters had the right distance between them. The clerk lifted the card and set it on a square of cloth like jewelers use when they don't want to scratch a ring. He said my name and said the word renewal with it. He slid the card forward and asked me to sign the line on the activation form. The pen wrote smooth, and I signed without asking my hand to hurry. He stamped the form's bottom corner, the small square stamp leaving its neat border and date in a voice only stamps have.
He said there had been an error that first day. He did not say it was my fault. He did not say it was nobody's fault. He said it was a technical issue and that they had adjusted the morning process so that the present slips the desk prints now trigger a review if a name isn't called within a stretch of minutes. He said thank you for asking for proof and for patience, and that he had started to underline the quiet hours on the weekly sheet because he saw who needed them. The words did not feel like a performance. They felt like lumber planed and squared. The silver-haired librarian nodded once, slow, like the head of a person who has seen rooms change a little when small things are named. I held the card with my thumb on the blank back so I wouldn't leave prints on the front yet. The plastic had a faint chemical smell that said new. I placed it beside the index card on the envelope for a second, the 2 rectangles touching like cousins. I clipped the activation form on top of the packet and wrote the time in my notebook. Renewal issued, 9 minutes. Proof, active card and stamped activation. I drew a box and put a check in it. The pencil made a small square sound when it left the paper. The clerk printed one more sheet without me asking. It said card issued, date, time, staff initials. He initialed it in a hand that had learned to write neat for other people. He slid it across and said one for your file. I put it under the stamp page and watched the packet turn into a document that could hold up in a wind. The librarian pointed to the side desk and asked if I wanted to log in once under the new status and print a confirmation. I did. The terminal woke with a soft buzz and a short brightness. The login accepted me like the tone the transit gate had given me the week before. I printed the one-line confirmation, last login, active card,
and the printer gave me the warm slip with the little line of type. I stapled it to the packet in the corner, clean and tidy. The stapler clacked with the little authority a stapler has when it knows where it belongs. The volunteer in the wool cap appeared again and asked if I wanted the new help hour sheet. He had already underlined the quiet window. He said he underlines it for people who make underlining count. I thanked him and wrote staffing hours on the margin of my notebook. At the exit of the desk area, the security guard with the bun stood with her clipboard. She gave the card a small look, the kind a person gives to a new driver's license, checking that it feels real in the air. She nodded, put a check beside my name on her list, and said, "Welcome back," the way a person says welcome to a neighbor returning from a short trip. The welcome slid into my chest and made a new shelf there. I stayed to use the card in the way a person tests a chair he built. I borrowed a book with large type about city photography so I could try to see the streets I walk with a different frame. The machine beeped politely and printed a slip that said when the book wanted to come home. The slip smelled of heat and ink and something like glue. I put it in the envelope under library and wrote the due date in the notebook so it would be a thing my hand knew, not just my eyes. I wrote the title because I like to see the names of things lined up in a list. On my way across the lobby, the young mother with the stroller saw me and said, "The card looks good in your hand." Her baby squeezed the mitten around nothing and opened it again. The volunteer with the wool cap stuck a flyer closer to the top of the board and stepped back to make sure it sat straight. The librarian placed a new stack of temporary access handouts with an extra instruction sheet on top that said where to find help if your name does not appear when you know it should. For a second, it looked like the room had accepted a small lesson and made a place for it. I left the card warm in my wallet next to the index card and headed to the community center to make the day complete in the way I had drawn on the page. The room smelled like lemons again, and a pot of coffee that had been kind too long. The instructor with the straight handwriting ran the last session of the basics course and printed an attendance log with my name on it and a line at the bottom that said, "Series completed." It was not a certificate with a ribbon. It was a line that said a person showed up enough times in a row to be counted. She said they could print a simple certificate if I wanted one for a file. I said yes, not because paper makes a person, but because paper makes a path visible. The printer coughed once and gave me a sheet with my name centered in a black box that had no pretension. The paper felt heavier than it looked. I held it so the ink would settle. I slid it under courses and wrote the time in the notebook. Basics completed, 20 minutes, proof, certificate page. On my way out, a man from the neighborhood who fixes bicycles in his kitchen asked if I could help him make a small list for his appointments. He had seen my notebook and liked the 3 lines. I told him I could sit with him for 15 minutes the next morning, and we would write a page he could copy every day. We agreed to meet at the library tables near the window where the light behaves. He thanked me with a grip on my forearm that measured what he was asking against what I was given, and found the balance true. I wrote the time and place in my notebook and wrote beside it, "For him, not for applause." The church door was open when I passed, and the man with the clipboard waved me inside. He had the Winter Reading Group bulletin proof in his hand, and he wanted me to check that my last name was spelled the way I prefer. It was. He asked if I would say a few words at the first gathering about keeping simple attendance and returning the sheet, because some folks like hearing rules from a voice that sounds like theirs. He said I had the right tone for that. I said I would speak for exactly 1 minute and then hold the paper so others could sign it. He laughed and said exactly was the word he wanted to hear. He circled the first date again on my small card and handed it back. The card's brain kissed my thumb. I walked back toward home with the box under my arm, inside the envelope, and the card inside the wallet. A neighbor shouted from a second-floor window that the landlord had posted new laundry room hours and that the sign made sense for once. I looked at the board in the hallway when I reached my building, and the sign did make sense. Someone had used larger type and short lines, and the hours matched the buses that came on the quarter hour. It was a small thing, and I had not done it, but it felt like the block had decided to speak more plainly to itself. At the apartment, I set the envelope on the table and opened the box like a person opens a drawer he has built. The sleeves took what I fed them without arguing. I placed the active card on top of the packet and set the stamped activation and the staff initialed sheet beneath. I put the course certificate under Courses and the reading group proof under Community. I wrote Card Issued, Series Completed, Reading Group Contact Confirmed across the day's line in my notebook because some days deserve a little banner you can still read a year later. Then I took the index card from my wallet and looked at the corners that had been polished by my thumb. The ink had not faded. The words had grown deeper in the paper the way rain darkens a road and then leaves it stronger.
I thought about what to do with the card. I wanted it near me. I also wanted it where it could make a mark bigger than my pocket. I cut a new card the same size and wrote the 3 words in the same hand. On the back I wrote HQ, Library, and the church address. I put the new card in my wallet and placed the old one on the inside of the box lid where my eye would meet it every time I lifted the top. The tape pressed down with a hiss like a whisper that said, "Stay with it." I closed the box and put my hand on the lid the way you hold a book on your lap after you finish a chapter you didn't want to end. When I went back to the library in the late afternoon to sit with the man from the neighborhood and make his 3-line appointment page, the lobby smelled like wet wool and paper again. The volunteer with the wool cap had moved the temporary access flyer to the center so it was the first thing a person saw when they looked for help. The silver-haired librarian had a new stack of present slips and a note under them that said, "Ask us to stamp." The clerk with the careful hair called a name, and when the person did not answer, he looked out into the room and said the name again with a tone that asked the person to believe they belonged. We sat by the window where the light behaves. I drew the 3 lines on his page and wrote the words for what they held: client, time, work. He copied the page 3 times and said the act of copying felt like telling tomorrow he would meet it. He tucked the page into a folder and wrote his name on the tab in the clean letters he had learned to use in school and forgotten to use at a desk. He smiled like a man who has tuned a wheel and watched it run straight for the first time in months. He thanked me with words that had no extra syrup on them. I said, "Paper is patient if you are." He nodded and repeated it once like he was testing a tool against wood. Before I left, the clerk stepped away from the desk and met me near the door. He held out a short letter with the library's header and said, "We send these only sometimes, but we thought it right." The letter said a renewal had been processed and apologized for the error on the first visit. It was written in a tone that did not call itself apology. It simply did what apology should do. At the bottom was a line about service improvements and present slips, and a line that invited me to stop by during a quiet window if I wanted to share suggestions. He had initialed the bottom corner. The paper made a sound when I folded it to fit the envelope, the sound of something that would hold up to being read again. I walked home in the kind of light that makes even cracked sidewalks look honest. The transit pass tapped at the gate with its yes tone, and I wrote the time next to the word tapped in my notebook because I wanted the day to end the way it began. Count it. In the apartment, I laid the new letter on top of the packet and pressed the clip until it clicked. I drew a check in the little square next to renewal outcome on the 30, 60, 90 page and let the pencil rest. I wrote one more line on the page in the space beneath the boxes. Speak plainly, show proof, return to HQ. The card in my wallet found its place. The box under the window found its lid. The room found a quiet that was not empty, but built. My name belonged where it was printed. My papers belonged where my hand could reach them. If anyone asked how, I could point to steps on a page, not just a feeling in my chest. Dignity is a habit with receipts. Purpose is the work of putting them in order and walking back the next day. If you valued this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do in my place. Until the next story.